Hey, good morning. Chuck here with appledrains. If you own a sump pump, whether it be down in the basement, a crawl space, or even a backyard sump pump, you need to take a look at these top tips of getting ready for spring. You know, it's been frozen all winter up north, and spring rains are coming. It's going to flood. You know it's going to flood, and it's going to be 6 or 8, 10 days of rain. You better make sure that that sump pump is in good working order. So let's take a look at some top tips and how these sump pumps actually work. So let's start with the float system. There's a couple of different kinds of floats. One is the ball, the flappy ball like this one, and it swings up, kicks on the pump. Can you hear it? Kicks on the pump. The other is a straight up and down single pole float, and that one, as the water rises, comes up, kicks on the pump. Water goes down in the pit, turns off the pump. We want to make sure that we have good power in our pump. That pump's been sitting there all winter, and probably no water has been coming in because no rain. In the wintertime, even down here in the south, it's relatively dry, so some pumps don't really operate during the dry season. Up north, when that ground's frozen, nothing's falling down into that ground to get into your basement or your crawl space, so usually there's not any real problem until spring. So we want to make sure we've got power to the pump, and we want to make sure that that float works. So reach down in that sump basin. You can use a glove, a hook, whatever you got, and just lift up that float. See if you have power. It should kick right on, just like that. Same thing here. Okay, let's talk about how much water should be in that sump basin. Sump pumps, they're all different. You can see where the inlet is here. You see these little holes around here? This is where water comes in, and the impeller lifts it up and sends it out. So we could have just 1 inch of water down in there. This one, the Drummond, it actually sucks water from quite shallow. Down at the bottom, you can see the impeller at the bottom. So there'll be even less water when this thing's not functioning. Okay, the float system. The flappy float, I don't really care for, but they do have a purpose. In other words, they allow more water to enter your pit. You can adjust that right here. Simply undo this little screw, and you can pull this float out farther, and it will give it more travel, so that this one has about 8 inches of travel before it kicks on. Hear it kick on? So from this point to where it shuts off is about 8 inches. So we could have a lot of water come into that pit, and the pump will take it out, it'll fill up again, lift up the float, send it out. Pretty simple. The single pole, I like it better because it's more protected. It doesn't get stuck against the side of the pit. I think it works a lot better, but it does move a lot of water many times, because as that water rises, this float comes up and kicks on. Here on the Drummond, on this float right here, you can see it's only got about maybe 4 inches of travel. So every time the water level rises 4 inches, it's going to kick on. That's fine. These are great pumps, and they have millions of cycles, and not to worry about that at all. But you can let your pit hold more water if you use a flappy float, and that will allow it to hold more water before it kicks on. Which one's better? Like I said, I don't care for this flappy float because it does tend to get stuck against the side of the pit. It can get stuck in the on position, or as it comes down and shuts off, maybe it's getting obstructed here by the inlet pipe. Who knows? But it gets stuck and it doesn't work. So the single pole float to me is a better pump. But it doesn't matter. Maybe you have this pump, maybe you have that pump. Here's a big Zoller, and it's a 1/2 horsepower. And it's got a pretty good amount of travel. It's got about 5 to 6 inches of travel before that kicks on. It comes up, you hear it click, and it kicks on. So this one's a pretty good little pump. It's a 1/2 horsepower pump. Maybe yours is a 1/2, maybe yours is a 1/3, maybe it's a 1/4 power. The big difference is how far are you going to send that water? If you're in a basement, minimum is probably about 1/3 of a horsepower, which these are both 1/3 of a horsepower, because you got to lift that water up from under your basement floor, send it up, and send it out above ground. So you're lifting it 8, 10, 12 feet. That's a long ways to push water. And then gravity usually takes over and it sends it out to the street. If you've got an outdoor system, the backyard sump pump, I really suggest you use a 1/2 horsepower pump, whether it be a Zoller, Myers, there's all kinds of pumps, it doesn't matter, but a good 1/2 horsepower pump, because you're going to lift that water up and you're going to send it 60, 80, 100, 200 feet. You need a good pump to push that water. I've tested out the Drummond and it does work pretty good in the backyard. The 1/3 of a horsepower, it does work pretty good. And does it cycle a lot? Well, you know, when it rains and it kicks on and off. Same thing on this float, makes no difference. So the big tip there, like I said, is making sure, number one, you've got good power to your pump. Make sure that float is operational. Okay, next is going to be to check out that check valve. And you can see the check valve here on the Drummond. It's right here, and it could be anywhere. It could be down in the pit. It could be, you know, up high on the wall. It doesn't matter. The check valve stops the water as water is lifted up. It stops the water from coming back down, and that's very important because we don't want the water to run our impeller backwards. Check valves usually don't go bad. They last a long time, but you want to make sure that that's working. So fill up your sump basin with water, kick it on, make sure your float's kicking things on and off, and after that pump shuts off, see if you hear water coming back. If you hear water coming back down through there, then your check valve is bad. And usually what happens is, you know, it's got a rubber seat inside of it, so that rubber seat could leak a little water and it will just drain that water out. If that's the case, you need to replace the check valve. And it's really simple to do. You've seen me install the check valve so many times. These are no hub bands, no hub adapters, 5/16 inch nut driver, unscrew it, pull it off, replace that. It's really simple to do. Okay, let's go look inside of a sump basin and see what else we need to look at, because remember, it hasn't rained now for 5 or 6 months, and we're coming into that rainy season. It's going to rain. It's going to rain hard. So on your outdoor sump basin, there's a couple of things that you should check here before the spring, all the rains and all that snow melts up north. Simply reach down, find that switch, the float, lift it up, and that thing should kick right on. You hear that running? So we know that pump's in good working order. And then also you want to look around the bottom and see how much debris is down here on the bottom. Notice that there's a little bit of mud down there, but the impeller, the bottom of the pump, is fine. The other thing to notice here on this one is, see the rocks underneath of it? Those rocks are not to raise the pump up to let it hold more water. It's simply to make the connection from that port right there come up to the discharge. It has nothing to do with how much water the pit holds or anything like that. It's just, you know, leveling that pump, raising or lowering the pump to make a good connection. That's all. So yeah, this pit's looking really good, and this is ready for the rain. So there's actually two kinds of basins. One is a solid basin like this, and it has a footer tile, the drain tile that comes in underneath the basement floor. Comes into the sump basin, and the sump pumps down there, lifts it up and sends it out. The other kind is a seepage basin. In other words, it could be round like this one, it could be square. Sometimes there's gravel down here at the bottom, but there's holes all the way around this little liner right here. And water just comes through from under the floor, sump pumps down there, lifts it out. Let's look at a flappy valve, the float system, and see why I don't like that, especially in the seepage basin. Okay, so we've got this little 1/3 of a horsepower down here, but you can see the flappy float. See how it gets stuck? Water will still push this up and around, and it will come up, but it can get stuck in the on position. So I don't really care for these, especially in a seepage basin. Better off to use the single pull float, and this is 12 inches round. Usually if they're square, they're 12 inches round. So the seepage basins, again, they're usually in basements that don't get a whole lot of water. But if you've got a basement that gets lots of water, then you need a big basin. So here's the single pole float inside of a seepage basin, and you can see that single pole float, it's never going to get stuck against the side. So it's a much better operation. But again, whether you've got this seepage basin or whether you've got the big basin, you need to check this float, make sure you got power coming on and off, and then check that check valve as well. Okay, let's take a look at an outdoor system. And you can see we've got a sump basin installed. We've got a nice lid on the top, got the power that comes down to the pump, got the discharge, check valve, and the discharge which goes over to a natural area. The water does not come in these holes at the top of the sump basin. That's not where we collect water. We collect water from a catch basin and a French drain. That goes over to the sump basin. So this system works exactly like it would be in your crawl space or your basement. It makes no difference. We collect the water. We're using a catch basin because we're collecting surface water out here. But in the basement, there would be a French drain, a footer tile, the drain tile under your basement floor. That comes over to the sump basin. And as that water is collected, let's lift this lid up. Bring you over here. As water rises in the sump basin, you can see the float, it's just about to kick on. As that water rises, there it goes. You can see how quickly the pump takes it down. So we talked about travel, and I mean, I can see that's about 6 inches of travel. In other words, the water's got to come up 6 inches before this float kicks on, and when it does, it takes the water right out. This pump's looking really good. The basin looks clean. Everything looks really good here. But you need to check your pump, whether it's in the crawl space. I know it's hard to get down in the crawl space, but if you can get in there, check that operation of your pump before the rains come. You know, we've just had a good rain all through the Midwest into the Northeast, turned to ice in some places. But when that all melts, all that water is going to go down into the basement and the crawl space, and you need to make sure these systems work good. So the video is here to remind you that spring is just around the corner. I mean, it's spring here, but it's going to be spring where you are soon. And it's time to take a look at that sump pump and that system, your basement, your crawl space, or the outdoor system, either one. Because I promise you that it probably hasn't run all winter long. Ground's frozen, water cannot get down through there, so it's just a tiny little bit of groundwater, which usually just seeps away. This is the time of year that as that water from the ground is able to travel down to your basement and get under that floor, that the system is going to kick on. It's also that time of year where we have extreme temperatures. As spring comes, we've got 20-degree nights and 65-degree days. What happens is now our system's pumping water, and if you don't have a good discharge where it runs downhill, you're going to freeze because there's going to be water left in that pipe. Take a look at the description box below for some links to some good videos on how to prevent that. Hey, this is Chuck with Appledrains reminding you that if you believe you can do something, I guarantee you can do it. Have a great day.